Hey. Dana checked the tent zipper twice that night, out of old habit, nothing more. On the second night, she watched it move on its own, sliding open an inch at a time, slow and deliberate, like something learning how a zipper works. No wind, no animal breathing loud enough to fog the mesh. Nothing on the other side that she could see. She never camped alone again after that weekend. She barely finished telling her sister what happened. It started 3 days earlier, with a breakup and a quiet piece of forest chosen because nobody would follow her there. According to the account, Dana had never planned to camp alone. She and her ex had done it together for years, the kind of trip where somebody else handled the tent stakes and she handled the food. When the relationship ended in early spring, she found herself with a long weekend already blocked off on the calendar and nowhere to be. A friend suggested the state forest 2 hours north, past the part of the mountains most people stopped at for the overlook photo and kept driving. Dana liked that idea. She didn't want company. She didn't want cell signal either, not really, though she would come to regret that particular wish before the trip was over. She left on a Thursday morning with a full tank of gas and a cooler that smelled like the last 4 camping trips she'd taken with someone else. The drive-in was uneventful, winding higher into thinner air, past a gas station with a hand-painted sign advertising night crawlers and fresh coffee, past a ranger kiosk with a stack of trail maps curling at the corners in a plastic box nobody had refilled in a while. She bought a cup of the coffee anyway. It was bad, burnt at the bottom of the pot, and she drank it anyway because it was warm and her hands were cold from the drive. The campground had 2 loops. The front loop, close to the entrance, was half full with families and a scout troop somebody had clearly overpromised a quiet weekend to. The back loop was almost empty, a scattering of sites strung along a gravel road that thinned the farther it went, the numbers on the wooden posts getting harder to read as the paint wore off. Dana picked Site 16, mostly because it had a flat spot for the tent, and enough distance from the nearest occupied site that she wouldn't hear anyone else's radio. She didn't clock, at the time, that the trailhead register near her site hadn't been signed in almost 3 weeks. She didn't think to ask why. Setting up alone took longer than she remembered. She'd forgotten how much of the process depended on somebody else holding a pole steady while you staked the corners, and she laughed at herself a little, out loud, for how long it took her to get the rainfly straight. By the time she had the tent up, the fire ring cleared of old ash, and a cold sandwich eaten standing next to the car, the light had gone. That particular gold color mountain light gets right before it disappears fast, all at once, like someone flipped a switch. She texted her sister a photo of the campsite, said she was fine, said she'd call tomorrow if she had signal, which she wasn't sure she would. The message showed 1 bar and then none. She didn't think much of it. Signal out here was always spotty. That was part of the point of coming. The evening went the way these evenings go when you're used to doing them with someone else, and you're doing them alone for the first time in years. She built a small fire, more for the light than the warmth, since the night wasn't especially cold. She sat with it a while, listening to the campground settle, a dog barking twice somewhere on the front loop, a car door somewhere else, the particular quiet that isn't silence so much as the absence of people trying to talk over it. She zipped the tent before she got in it, checked the zip a second time out of a habit she'd had since she was a kid, her father's old rule about keeping bugs and raccoons out, and got into her sleeping bag a little before 11. She woke sometime after midnight to a small sound near the food bag, which she'd hung, more or less correctly, from a low branch a few yards from the tent. A soft zipper sound, quick, almost polite. She lay still and listened, the way you do when you're deciding whether something is worth getting up for. It came again, and this time she was almost sure it was the sound of her own dry bag zipper. the one she'd left clipped to the outside of her pack near the food. Raccoons went for zippers sometimes, she'd heard, drawn by the sound of something opening as much as the smell of food behind it. She unzipped the tent door enough to shine her flashlight out. The beam caught nothing but the shape of the hanging bag, swaying slightly, untouched, the food inside it undisturbed. She told herself it was a squirrel that had already moved on, zipped the tent back up, and went back to sleep telling herself campgrounds were noisy places and she'd chosen to be here. The second time she woke, it was different, and she knew it before she was even fully awake. The way you sometimes know a sound has repeated before your conscious mind catches up to counting it. The same zipper sound, the same soft, quick rhythm. But this time it was not coming from the direction of the food bag at all. It was coming from somewhere close to the tent itself, low, near the ground, moving slightly with each repetition, as though whatever was making the sound was walking a slow, half circle around where she lay. She held still. She counted her own heartbeat instead of counting the sound, which was its own kind of mistake, because it meant she wasn't paying attention to the fact that the sound was getting closer to the tent door with each pass rather than staying in one place. She didn't unzip the tent again that night. She lay with her flashlight gripped in one hand, off, because some part of her didn't want to see whatever might be standing close enough to make that kind of sound this close to thin nylon walls. The zipper noise stopped sometime before dawn, the way most strange sounds do when you wait long enough. And she told herself in the gray, early light that it had probably been exactly what she'd assumed the first time. A raccoon working at something else. A branch against fabric. She had, after all, heard nothing that sounded remotely like footsteps. Nothing that sounded like breathing. Nothing that couldn't be explained by an animal curious about a stranger's campsite. That should have been the end of it. She almost convinced herself it was, packing away the thought along with her breakfast dishes, telling herself she'd sleep better the second night now that she knew what the sound was. It was only the beginning of the pattern she would notice the next night, the one that would make her stop believing, by morning, that anything about Site 16 had ever been ordinary at all. Dana almost packed up and left the next morning, not because she was scared exactly, but because 2 nights alone felt like enough, and she had proven to herself what she'd come out here to prove. Then the day turned warm and easy, the kind of afternoon that makes a person forget the specifics of what unsettled them the night before. She hiked a short loop trail from the trailhead near her site, saw a deer and 2 chipmunks and nothing else, and came back to camp feeling foolish for how carefully she'd listened to a raccoon the previous night. She told herself she'd stay the second night after all. The car was parked, the tent was already up, and driving the forest road alone in the dark felt like a worse idea than staying somewhere she already knew. She built the fire a little bigger that evening, mostly for company. She cooked a real dinner this time instead of another cold sandwich, ate it slowly, and let the fire burn down while she sat with it, the way people do when the actual point of being alone in the woods is just to sit with your own thoughts for a while without anyone asking what's wrong. It worked for a few hours. She thought about her ex a little less than she had the day before. She thought the trip might actually be doing what she'd hoped it would. She banked the fire before bed, checked the zipper twice, the same old habit, and told herself the noise from the previous night was done being interesting to whatever animal had made it. She was mostly right until she wasn't. The zipper sound came back a little after 1 in the morning, but this time it didn't come alone. Underneath it, close to the mesh window near her head, she heard something breathing. Not loud, not labored, just steady, slow, close enough that she could hear the small catch at the top of each inhale, the kind of sound a large dog makes when it's resting its chin near your ear. She lay frozen, listening to it, telling herself animals breathe loudly sometimes, telling herself the mesh window distorted sound, telling herself several things at once that she didn't entirely believe even as she thought them. She had left her flashlight outside the tent that evening, propped against her pack near the vestibule, a habit from years of camping where she liked having a light within easy reach the second she unzipped the door. When she turned her head toward the mesh window to look for it, she found it. It was on. Its beam was pointed away from the tent, toward the tree line, casting a thin cone of light between two trunks about 30 feet out, and it was blinking. Not steady. Blinking in slow, deliberate pulses, the way a flashlight blinks when somebody's hand is loosely cycling the switch. She reached down beside her sleeping bag, where her other hand had been resting against her actual flashlight the entire time, the one she always kept inside the tent with her at night. It was off. It had been off the whole time. She was holding it. The one outside, the one blinking from the tree line, was not hers, or it was hers, and it was somewhere it should not have been, and either answer was worse than the one before it. The breathing near the window stopped the moment she moved. She held completely still after that, the way you do when some old, useless animal instinct tells you that stillness is the only tool you have left. A few minutes later, she heard her own name. Just once. Low, almost conversational, coming from somewhere past the fire ring. The kind of tone a person uses when they're trying not to startle you rather than trying to scare you. For one strange, hopeful second, she thought it might be a hiker, someone looking for a lost dog, someone who'd need directions back to the main loop. She almost answered. She had her mouth half open to call back before some other part of her, older and less reasonable, told her not to. She thought suddenly of the campground host, a heavy-set older man who checked her permit in on the first afternoon, and mentioned, almost as an aside while stapling her tag to the post, that folks didn't usually camp past Site 14 anymore, not since the ranger stopped doing regular checks out that far. He'd said it lightly, like a comment about poor cell service, and moved on to ask if she needed firewood. She was in Site 16. She hadn't thought about that number since the day she arrived. She thought about it now. Her phone had died sometime in the afternoon, and she hadn't bothered charging it from the car, since there was nothing here worth checking anyway. Her keys were in the tent with her, a small comfort that did nothing for her actual situation. Since the car was 30 feet away across open ground, she did not want to cross in the dark. The fire had burned down to coals hours ago, and she hadn't cut more dry wood before bed. Leaving the tent meant crossing dark ground toward a car with a dead quiet campsite around her, and whatever had been breathing near her window somewhere close enough to hear her unzip the door. She did not unzip it. When her name came a second time, closer, she stayed exactly where she was. Flashlight off, breath as shallow and quiet as she could manage, staring at the ceiling of the tent instead of the mesh window, telling herself that whatever this was, it would eventually get bored of a person who wasn't going to answer. She has never fully explained, even to her sister, how she got through the hours after that. She says only that she waited, and that waiting was the hardest thing she has ever done, and that somewhere around the point the birds started up again in the gray early light, she finally let herself believe the worst of it was over. In daylight, the campsite looked almost exactly as she'd left it, except for two things. The first was a wide, unbroken track of drag marks in the dirt, circling the tent completely, a full loop with no gaps, the kind of pattern that would require whatever made it to have walked entirely around her while she slept without ever once crossing into the dead firelight close enough for her to have seen it clearly. The second she found near the fire ring, half buried in the dirt, dulled with age. An old flashlight, a model she didn't recognize, the casing scratched and the brand worn off. the kind of design she was fairly sure hadn't been manufactured in years. She brought it to the campground host on her way out, mostly because she didn't know what else to do with it and didn't want it sitting in her car for the 2-hour drive home. He turned it over in his hands for a long moment, thumb running over the worn casing, and went quiet in a way that made her more uneasy than anything from the night before. He said he'd seen one like it before. He didn't finish the sentence. He set it down on the counter of the little ranger kiosk, thanked her for bringing it in, and didn't offer anything else no matter how long she stood there waiting for him to. Dana still camps, she says, when people ask. She just hasn't done it alone since. She keeps the site number in her head now, whatever it happens to be, and she has never again zipped a tent shut without listening first, all the way through the sound, before she lets herself believe it's actually done. The next account comes from a couple renting a cabin near an old logging road, the kind of place people only find because someone's grandfather owned it, or because the listing photos showed a wraparound porch and total quiet, and nothing else worth mentioning. Mark woke to knocking, and for a few groggy seconds he assumed it was Rachel's phone alarm going off in another room. It took him longer than it should have to place where the sound was actually coming from, mostly because the answer didn't make sense the moment he landed on it. The knocking was not on the door. It was not on the porch. It was coming from inside the wall beside the bed. 3 slow knocks, close enough that he could feel the faint vibration through the headboard where it touched the plaster. He lay still, listening, telling himself it was pipes settling, the kind of sound old houses make when the heat kicks on. Across the hall, through the crack of the bedroom door, he could just make out the shape of the backroom door standing slightly open, though he was almost certain he'd shut it the night before. According to Mark, who submitted the account nearly a year after it happened, he and Rachel had booked the cabin for their anniversary almost on a whim. The listing had good photos, a wraparound porch, a view of nothing but trees in every direction, and a price that felt right for a weekend neither of them wanted to spend answering emails. It sat at the end of a long gravel spur off an old logging road, far enough out that the listing description used the word total privacy twice, which should have been their first hint of something, though at the time it read only as a selling point. They arrived a little before dark on a Friday, tires bouncing over ruts the whole way in, GPS losing signal about a mile out, and leaving them to follow the last turn from memory, and a screenshot Rachel had taken earlier that morning. The cabin itself was better than the photos, honestly. Wood-paneled and warm-looking even from an outside. A porch that wrapped most of the way around. A woodpile stacked neatly against the near wall. They unpacked groceries into a kitchen that smelled faintly of pine cleaner, got the wood stove going after 2 failed attempts, and spent the first hour doing the small, comfortable rituals of settling into a place that wasn't home. Rachel found the guest book on the counter and read a few entries out loud in a joking voice, mostly compliments about the porch and the quiet. One entry about a family reunion. Nothing that stood out at the time. The back bedroom sat at the end of a short hallway off the kitchen, its door slightly off in its frame in the particular way old doors get when a house has settled over decades. The listing hadn't mentioned it specifically, and neither of them thought much about it beyond a glance inside. A stripped bed frame, some stacked boxes, the kind of room that gets used for storage in most old houses. Mark noted, without really registering it as strange, that the door didn't sit flush no matter how he pushed it shut, always resting open an inch or two, as though the frame itself had shifted just enough to keep it from latching properly. They ate dinner on the porch despite the cold, drank the wine they'd brought for the occasion, and turned in a little after 10, tired from the drive and the hour spent wrestling the wood stove into cooperation. The first knock came around 10. a single sound against what they both assumed was the porch railing. Mark went out to check. Found nothing. A raccoon or a branch against wood being the most reasonable explanation for a single knock in an old cabin surrounded by trees. He came back in, told Rachel it was nothing, and settled back into the couch with the fire going, telling himself, the way people do in old houses, that old cabins make noise. The second knock came around 11, and this one was different enough that neither of them could talk themselves past it easily. It came from the direction of the back room, 3 distinct knocks, evenly spaced, deliberate in a way that a settling house does not usually manage. Rachel suggested a pipe, something in the plumbing knocking against a joist when the water pressure shifted. Mark didn't argue with her out loud. In his head, though, he found himself counting the knocks again, turning the number over, because pipes don't count to 3. Pipes bang once, or they bang erratically, in fits and starts that don't sound like punctuation. This had sounded exactly like punctuation, like the end of a sentence. He got up anyway and checked the back room, mostly to reassure himself and, if he was honest, to reassure Rachel, who he could tell was more unsettled than she was letting on. The door was standing open the same inch or two it always seemed to rest at, the room beyond dark and unremarkable, boxes stacked as they had been that afternoon. Nothing disturbed that he could see by flashlight. He shut the door as firmly as he could manage, felt it catch imperfectly against the frame the way it always did, and told Rachel everything was fine. They didn't talk much more about it that night, though. Mark noticed Rachel left the hallway light on when they finally went to bed, something she never did at home. Always the first one in the house to turn lights off before sleeping. He lay awake a while longer than he wanted to admit, listening to the ordinary sounds of the cabin settling around them, the wood stove ticking as it cooled, wind moving through the porch eaves, nothing that repeated, nothing that counted itself out in careful groups of 3. He must have drifted off eventually, because the next thing he was aware of was the knocking again, and this time there was no ambiguity about where it was coming from. It was behind the headboard, close enough that he felt it more than heard it at first. A dull, patient tapping against the wall directly behind where his head rested against the pillow. He sat up slowly, careful not to wake Rachel, and it was in that moment, turning to look across the dark bedroom toward the hallway, that he saw the back room door standing open again. Not the same worn-in inch or two it always rested at. Fully open, wide enough that the darkness of the room beyond seemed to spill a little into the hallway itself. He was almost certain he had shut it. He remembered the small resistance of the frame catching, the particular give of old wood settling against old wood. He remembered specifically wedging a kitchen chair against it after Rachel had gone quiet about the pipe theory. A small extra measure neither of them had discussed out loud, but that he'd done anyway. The kind of thing you do at 11 at night in an unfamiliar cabin when you want to feel like you've done something. The chair was still there in the hallway, exactly where he'd left it. It simply wasn't doing the job he'd left it there to do. The door stood open past it, as though the chair had never been an obstacle at all. He didn't wake Rachel. He sat there a long moment listening, the knocking behind the headboard gone silent now, replaced by the particular stillness that follows a sound you can't fully explain, the kind of quiet that feels less like an absence and more like something waiting to see what you'll do next. He didn't get up to close the door again. He told himself, lying back down carefully, that he'd deal with it in the morning, that whatever this was would look considerably less strange with actual daylight behind it. Rachel said it was probably a pipe when he mentioned the knock behind the headboard the next morning over coffee, her voice a little too quick, a little too eager to have an easy answer available. Mark didn't push it. He counted the knocks again in his head anyway, the same 3, evenly spaced, precise. Pipes don't count to 3. He didn't say it out loud. He filed it away instead, the way you file away something you're not ready to fully believe yet, and went to go check on the guest book, hoping, without quite admitting why, that someone before them might have written down something useful. The guest book didn't have anything useful, at least not at first glance. Mark flipped through a dozen entries, mostly compliments about the porch view, and one long entry from a family who'd stayed over a holiday weekend, describing a good time with no mention of anything unusual. It was only when he flipped further back, toward entries from roughly a year earlier, that he noticed something wrong with the binding. A page had been torn out, cleanly, close enough to the spine that it took him a second look to be sure it wasn't just a gap between 2 normal entries. The dates on either side of the missing page were close together, close enough that whatever had been written on the torn page would have covered almost exactly 1 year before the date they were currently staying. He didn't mention it to Rachel right away. He wasn't sure what there was to mention exactly, beyond a missing page in an old book, the kind of thing that could have happened for 100 mundane reasons. A stain, a bad entry, someone embarrassed by something they'd written. He put the guest book back on the counter and told himself he was reading too much into an old cabin's small imperfections. They spent the day the way you're supposed to spend a weekend like this, hiking a short trail off the gravel spur, cooking a real dinner instead of takeout, sitting on the porch with the wood stove crackling behind them and watching the light change over the trees. It was good, mostly. Rachel laughed more than she had the day before. Mark almost let himself forget about the knocking and the door and the missing page, right up until he texted the cabin's owner that afternoon, mostly out of a lingering itch he couldn't quite scratch any other way. He kept the message casual, said the back room door didn't seem to latch right, asked if that was normal or if there was a trick to it. The reply came back faster than he expected, and shorter. Just leave it be. It's not set up for guests. No explanation of what not set up meant. No offer to fix the latch, nothing beyond the flat instruction itself. Mark read it twice, showed it to Rachel, who shrugged it off as an owner not wanting to deal with a maintenance request on a weekend, and neither of them pushed the thought any further than that, though Mark noticed the message sat with him longer than it should have for something so ordinary. Rain started sometime after dinner, light at first, then heavier, drumming steadily against the tin roof in a way that was almost pleasant, the kind of sound that made the cabin feel more like shelter than it had before. By the time they turned in, the rain had settled into a steady, serious rhythm, and Mark noticed, checking his phone for a weather update out of habit, that the gravel spur they'd driven in on crossed a shallow dip that had been dry that afternoon, and was very likely not dry anymore. He didn't say anything to Rachel about it. There wasn't a decision to make yet. They were staying the night regardless. The propane heater, which had been running steadily since they arrived, started cutting out sometime around midnight, the flame catching and dying in short cycles that filled the cabin with brief spells of cold before it caught again. Mark checked the tank gauge with his phone flashlight and found it reading fuller than the cutting-out behavior suggested it should be, which didn't make him feel better so much as add one more small detail that didn't fit cleanly into an explanation. It was Rachel who found the handprint, a little after 1 in the morning, when she got up to check on the heater herself and paused by the hallway on her way back. She called Mark's name in a voice pitched low and strange, the kind of tone that makes you move faster than you mean to. She was standing at the mouth of the hallway, staring at the back room's small window, the one facing the side yard, visible through the open door that had, once again, refused to stay shut. The window was thick with dust on the inside, the way windows get in rooms nobody bothers to clean because nobody's supposed to be in them. Pressed into that dust, clear enough to make out fingers and the heel of a palm, was a handprint. It sat at adult height, at a spot that would put someone standing inside the room, facing the glass, looking out toward the yard. Rachel's first thought, she told Mark later, was that maybe she'd left it herself at some point checking the window, except she was fairly sure she'd never touched that window at all, and the size and shape of it didn't match her hand or Mark's either. They stood in the hallway a long moment, neither of them saying much, the rain loud on the roof, the propane heater ticking through another dying cycle behind them. Mark thought distantly about the chair he'd wedged against the door 2 nights before, the one that hadn't done its job, and about the torn guestbook page, and about the flat, oddly specific instruction from the cabin's owner not to worry about a room neither of them had asked about in the first place. That should have been enough to make them leave. Mark has said as much more than once, looking back on it, that any reasonable person faced with a locked room, a fresh handprint on the inside of its window, and an owner who wouldn't explain any of it should have packed the car and driven out that night regardless of the rain. What made them stay, in the end, wasn't stubbornness or curiosity. It was simpler than that. By the time they'd stood in that hallway long enough to seriously consider leaving, the gravel spur they'd need to cross was already underwater, and neither of them wanted to find out exactly how deep in the dark, in the rain, with a car that wasn't built for it. They went back to the main room instead, added wood to the stove, and sat together on the couch with every light in the cabin turned on, telling each other without much conviction that they'd sort it all out with the owner in the morning, that daylight would make the missing page and the handprint and the knocking feel smaller than they did right now. Neither of them said out loud what they were both thinking, which was that the back room's door, no matter what they wedged against it or how many times they shut it, seemed to open itself exactly when it wanted to, and that whatever had left that print on the inside of a locked room's window had been standing there, at some point, close enough to have heard everything they'd said in that hallway. They didn't sleep, not really. Mark dozed in short stretches on the couch, jolting awake each time the propane heater cycled, while Rachel sat upright beside him with a blanket pulled to her chin, watching the mouth of the hallway like it might do something if she looked away. The rain kept up steadily through the night, softer than before but constant, and somewhere under it, threaded through the ordinary sounds of an old house in a storm. The knocking started again, slower this time, more spaced out, coming from the back room with a patience that felt worse than urgency would have. It was somewhere close to 3 in the morning when Mark heard his name. Not shouted, not desperate, just spoken once, quietly from the direction of the hallway, in a voice pitched close enough to Rachel's that for one full second his body was already turning toward her to answer, before some other part of his brain caught up and stopped him. Rachel was sitting right beside him. She hadn't said anything. Her eyes were already wide, fixed on the same spot in the hallway, and he understood, looking at her face, that she'd heard it too, and that she knew, the same as he did, that it hadn't come from either of them. Neither of them spoke for a long moment after that. Mark reached over and took Rachel's hand, mostly because he needed to hold something solid, and she gripped it back hard enough to hurt a little, which he was grateful for, because it gave him something to focus on besides the hallway. They didn't discuss a plan out loud. There wasn't one to discuss. The chair was still wedged against the back room door, doing whatever job it had actually been doing all along, and neither of them intended to go check on it, or answer whatever had used Mark's name in a voice close enough to fool him for half a second. They stayed exactly where they were until the light outside the windows started to change, a gray that slowly gave way to something closer to actual morning, and only then did the knocking finally stop, all at once, the way it had every previous night, as though whatever was doing it understood the difference between dark and daylight as clearly as they did. Neither of them had said more than a few words to each other in hours. When Mark finally stood up, his legs stiff from sitting still so long, the first thing he noticed was the chair. It had been moved. Not far, maybe 6 inches from where he remembered wedging it the night before, angled slightly differently against the door, which was still, for whatever that was worth, shut. He crouched and looked at it a long moment, trying to work out whether he was misremembering the exact position from the night before, and decided eventually that he wasn't. Rachel found the second thing a few minutes later, out on the porch, checking to see if the gravel spur had drained enough to risk driving out. A small, muddy footprint sat on the porch boards near the steps, child-sized, clear enough to make out the shape of toes pressed into the mud. There were no other prints leading to it, none leading away. Just the one, isolated, as though whatever left it had simply appeared there and then not left at all. They packed quickly after that, not frantically, but with the particular efficiency of 2 people who have silently agreed not to discuss what they're doing or why. The gravel spur, when they finally drove it, was passable, the water shallower than either of them expected, given how deep it had sounded the night before. They stopped at the small general store near the highway to return the cabin's key, and it was there, in person, that they finally spoke to the owner face to face for the first time all weekend. He was an older man, weathered in the way of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors, and when Mark brought up the back room, mentioning the handprint and the torn guestbook page as evenly as he could manage, the owner's expression changed in a way that told them both he wasn't going to pretend this was the first time he'd heard something like it. He said the back room had been nailed shut by the previous owner, years before he'd bought the property, and that he genuinely didn't know why, only that he'd never had a reason to open it back up and had learned, over time, not to ask too many questions about a house that came with its own habits. He didn't offer anything more than that. No story, no explanation, no reassurance. He took the key back, thanked them for staying, and didn't meet Mark's eyes again before turning to help another customer. Mark checked the cabin's online listing a few months later, mostly out of the same lingering itch that had made him text the owner about the door in the first place. The listing was still up, still advertising the wraparound porch and the total privacy, but the back room no longer appeared in any of the photos. He couldn't say whether it had ever been removed deliberately or whether the owner had simply updated the pictures for some unrelated reason, and he didn't ask. They never went back. Mark says, when he tells the story now, that the strangest part wasn't the knocking, or the handprint, or even the missing page. It was that when the voice said Rachel's name that first time, it had gotten it exactly right. Every syllable, every cadence, close enough that either of them might have answered without thinking. When it said his, later that same night, it had almost gotten it right. Almost. Close enough to nearly work. Not close enough to be sure. The story after that comes from a ranger who still keeps the radio log from that week, tucked away somewhere he doesn't often look at anymore, from a district he transferred out of not long after the season had happened. Holt found the backpack a little before noon, sitting dead center on a trail that had been closed for 3 weeks, and his first thought, before anything else registered as wrong, was irritation. Someone had ignored the closure signs. That was the whole thought, complete and unremarkable, right up until he crouched down to pick the bag up and noticed there were no footprints leading to it. None in the soft mud on either side of the trail, none in the pine duff further back where a person coming off the ridge would have had to pass. Just the bag, small, child-sized, sitting upright and centered on the path as if someone had set it down gently and walked away without leaving a single mark. According to Holt, who told this story years after leaving the district, that backpack was the first thing that didn't fit, though it wouldn't be the last, and it wouldn't be the strangest. He'd been sent out to check storm damage on Trail 9 after a bad windstorm had closed it 3 weeks earlier. Routine work. The kind of shift that mostly involved noting downed timber for the maintenance crew and confirming the trail was safe to reopen. He'd worked that district long enough to have stopped being easily rattled by much of anything the woods could produce. That was, he says now, part of what made the rest of that week so hard to explain away. He'd started the morning the way he started most mornings out there, signing the trail register at the trailhead kiosk, noting the date and his unit number in a logbook that hadn't seen another entry in the weeks since the closure. He checked the boundary signs at the start of the trail, radioed his position into the district station out of habit more than necessity, and started up the grade with a clipboard and a chainsaw in the truck bed for anything too big to clear by hand. The morning was ordinary enough. Storm damage was worse than expected in a few sections. A couple of good-sized pines down across the trail, one root ball torn clean out of the hillside, exposing a wall of dirt and rock that would need attention before the trail reopened to the public. He noted it all, took a few photos for the file, worked his way steadily up toward the ridge where the trail eventually looped back down through a shallow canyon before rejoining the main system. It was somewhere past the second downed pine that he heard the whistle. 3 short blasts evenly spaced, coming from somewhere below him in the canyon. He knew the pattern the way anyone in search and rescue training knows it, drilled into him early in his career and never forgotten since. 3 short blasts meant found. It was the signal a team member used to call in a positive result during a search, the kind of thing that carried real information, not just noise. His first assumption was straightforward. Another crew was out there, maybe running a training exercise, maybe checking storm damage in a section he hadn't been briefed on. He radioed the district to check. The response came back quickly and firmly. No other crew was assigned to that canyon that day. Nobody was down there. Holt logged the whistle as a probable trespasser, someone who'd ignored the closure and was maybe in some kind of minor trouble, embarrassed enough to be signaling with an actual rescue whistle rather than just calling out. It was a reasonable explanation. It held together fine, right up until the whistle came again, 10 minutes later, from a different direction entirely, higher up the ridge, in terrain that would have taken considerably longer than 10 minutes to climb, even for someone in excellent condition moving with real urgency. He logged that too, the discrepancy in timing, the change in direction, filing it under the same probable trespasser theory, even as some part of him quietly did the math and didn't like the answer it produced. He didn't write down, in his official notes that day, the detail that actually bothered him most, which was that the whistle pattern hadn't just been 3 short blasts in some general sense. It had been exactly right. Perfect spacing, perfect duration, the kind of precision that came from someone who'd been trained the same way he had, using the same code, meaning the same thing. Found. Send help. It wasn't the sound of someone in distress trying to get attention. It was the sound of someone who knew exactly what they were signaling and expected it to be understood. He continued the shift, cleared the fallen timber he could manage with the chainsaw, and flagged the larger sections for a follow-up crew, and kept half an ear out the rest of the day for the whistle to return. It didn't. Not again that afternoon, and by the time he made his way back down to the trailhead in the late afternoon light, he'd mostly convinced himself the whole thing had a boring explanation he simply hadn't landed on yet. A hiker with search training who'd ignored the closure. A prank. Sound doing strange things in canyon terrain, bouncing and distorting in ways that made a distant, ordinary noise sound uncannily precise. He signed out at the trailhead register, closed the logbook, and was halfway back to the truck when something made him glance back at the register one more time. It was a small, unimportant impulse, the kind you don't examine too closely in the moment. The book looked the same as it had that morning. He didn't open it again. He got in the truck and drove back toward the station, the backpack sitting on the passenger seat beside him. And it was only later that evening, filling out his shift report at the station, that the retired ranger nearing the end of his own career, a man Holt had worked under for years and trusted more than most, stopped by his desk, glanced at the backpack sitting in an evidence bag on the corner, and asked, in a tone quieter than his usual voice, exactly where Holt had found it. Holt told him. Trail 9, centered on the path, no tracks leading to it. The older ranger didn't say much in response, just nodded slowly. The kind of nod that meant he'd already half expected the answer before he asked the question, and told Holt, before heading toward his own truck for the night. One thing that Holt would remember for the rest of his career. Don't answer the radio if the unit number doesn't match anyone currently on staff. He said it plainly, without elaboration, the way a person gives an instruction they expect to be followed without needing justification, and left before Holt could ask him what exactly he meant by it, or why, on a shift that had involved nothing but a whistle and an abandoned backpack. That warning felt like the single most important thing anyone had said to him all day. Holt didn't get much out of the older ranger beyond that one warning. Not that night and not in the days that followed. He tried, a few times, to bring it up again, framing it as idle curiosity rather than the genuine unease it actually was. But the man had a way of changing the subject that made it clear the conversation was closed. Holt let it go, mostly, and went back to work, though he found himself checking the unit numbers on incoming radio traffic more carefully than he used to, a habit he couldn't quite explain even to himself. It was 3 nights later, on an overnight shift covering for another ranger out sick, that the radio crackled with a call sign he didn't recognize. District radio traffic was small enough, and the roster stable enough, that Holt knew every active unit number by heart, the way you know a short list of phone numbers you dial often enough to never forget. This wasn't one of them. It came through clean, no static distortion, requesting his position in a voice that had the same cadence, the same particular way of clipping the ends of words, as a ranger who'd transferred out of the district 2 years earlier, a guy named Petey, whom Holt had liked well enough and hadn't thought about since he left. Holt didn't answer right away. He sat with the radio in his hand a long moment, the older ranger's warning sitting louder in his head than it had in days, and told himself there were a dozen boring explanations. A visiting crew from another district, a malfunctioning radio bleeding through on the wrong frequency, someone messing with the equipment as a joke. None of the explanations felt especially convincing, but he didn't need them to be convincing. He just needed a reason not to respond, and the warning gave him one. The voice came again a few minutes later, requesting his position a second time, and this time it included coordinates. Closer than the ones Holt had actually radioed in earlier that shift. Close enough that whoever, or whatever, was asking seemed to already have a better sense of where he was than he'd given them. He didn't confirm anything. He drove back toward the station instead, radio switched off entirely for the drive, watching his mirrors more than he wanted to admit, though the road behind him stayed empty the whole way. Back at the station, he pulled the roster and checked the unit number against every ranger who had ever worked the district, going back further than he strictly needed to. He found it eventually, an old assignment number that had been retired years earlier, back when he was still new to the job himself. He remembered, once he saw the date attached to it, that it corresponded almost exactly to the year a hiker had gone missing on Trail 9 and was never found, a case that had gone cold long before Holt transferred into the district. One of those old stories that got mentioned occasionally around the station without much detail attached to it. The kind of thing everyone half knew and nobody discussed in full. He didn't sleep well that night, if he slept at all. He waited it out at the station instead, another ranger on shift with him for most of the overnight hours, both of them keeping the conversation deliberately mundane, talking about anything except the radio traffic that had crackled through earlier. Near dawn, the radio burst once more. Brief, wordless, just static and then nothing, and neither of them acknowledged it out loud, though Holt noticed the other ranger's hand pause over his coffee cup for a beat too long before he kept talking like nothing had happened at all. The backpack, logged into evidence that week, turned out to match a description from an old missing child report, decades old, filed long before Holt had ever set foot in the district. He learned this from the paperwork, not from anyone willing to discuss it directly. And what struck him most wasn't the age of the case, but the condition of the bag itself. The fabric showed almost no wear, no fading, none of the deterioration you'd expect from something left outdoors for that many years. It looked, by every physical measure available to him, recently made, recently used, recently set down on that trail. The trail register, when he finally thought to check it again a few days later, had an entry he hadn't noticed before, dated sometime during the 3-week closure, in handwriting he didn't recognize from any current or former ranger he could think of. No name accompanied it, just a time and a single word beneath it. Found. Holt transferred districts the following spring. He'd tell people, if they asked, that it was for advancement, a better posting, more responsibility, and all of that was true enough on paper. What he doesn't usually say is that nobody at his old station uses the name Trail 9 anymore. Not casually, not in shift logs, not even in passing conversation. It's simply the closed section now, referred to that way by rangers who came on staff long after Holt left, and have no idea why the old name fell out of use, only that it did, sometime around the season he transferred out. He still keeps his radio tuned to a different channel at night. Even now, years and 2 districts removed from that particular canyon. He says it's just old training, an old habit picked up from somewhere he can't fully remember the origin of anymore. He knows that isn't true. He's just never found a version of the real explanation that felt safe enough to say out loud. The account after that starts on a road that isn't on any current map. The kind of shortcut a driver only finds once, usually by accident and rarely takes twice. Cole saw the man at mile 4 first, standing barefoot on the shoulder in weather that should have made that impossible to bear, and thought nothing of it beyond the ordinary concern you'd have for anyone stranded on a mountain grade after dark. It was at mile 12, seeing the same man standing in the exact same posture on a curve he had no earthly way of having beaten Cole to, that the whole night stopped making sense. He has never taken that road after dark again. Not for any delivery, not for any shortcut, no matter how much time it might save him. It started as nothing more than a driver behind schedule, trying to beat a storm over a mountain grade he'd driven 100 times before. According to Cole, the shortcut wasn't unusual for him. He'd been driving supply routes through that stretch of Appalachia for going on 6 years, and the mountain grade, though narrow and unforgiving in bad weather, cut nearly 40 minutes off the highway route on a good day. He was running late that particular evening, later than he liked to be with a storm front supposedly closing the main grade by midnight, and the shortcut felt like the obvious choice rather than any kind of risk worth thinking twice about. He stopped at the gas station at the base of the grade the way he always did, topping off the tank and grabbing a cup of coffee that had clearly been sitting on the burner since the morning shift. The clerk, an older man Cole had exchanged maybe 100 words with over the years, mentioned the storm coming in, said the fog would probably be thick up top by the time Cole reached the higher curves. Then, almost as an afterthought, in a tone that started light and turned serious halfway through the sentence, he told Cole not to flash his headlights at anyone he saw standing near the old bridge partway up the grade. Cole laughed it off, assumed it was some kind of local joke about deer or drunks wandering the road at night, and the clerk didn't laugh back. He just held Cole's eye a beat longer than the moment called for and said he meant it, plainly, before ringing up the coffee and turning to the next customer. Cole didn't think much more about it once he was back on the road. CB radio on for company. Fog already starting to gather in the low points of the grade the way it usually did once the temperature dropped. The first few miles were unremarkable. The kind of driving he could do without much conscious thought. Headlights cutting a narrow tunnel through the dark, and the fog thickening gradually as the road climbed. He saw the figure a little past mile 4, standing on the narrow shoulder, no vehicle in sight anywhere near him. No reason for a person to be standing there at all. Bare feet, even in the cold, which Cole noticed and immediately dismissed as some trick of the headlights or a man wearing dark socks that only looked bare in passing light. He slowed instinctively, the way you do for anyone who might be stranded, but the man didn't wave, didn't move, didn't so much as turn his head to acknowledge the truck slowing beside him. He just stood there, facing the road, still as a fence post. Cole told himself it was someone waiting for a ride, maybe drunk, maybe not thinking clearly, and decided against stopping. Stopping for a stranger alone on a mountain road at night wasn't smart. Storm or no storm, and he kept driving, watching the figure recede in his side mirror until the fog swallowed it whole. Mile 8 came almost exactly 11 minutes later by the clock on his dash, and it was there that Cole first felt something shift in his stomach that had nothing to do with the coffee. The same figure, same stance, same bare feet planted on cold gravel, same stillness that had nothing in common with how an actual stranded person behaves. Different curve, different section of the grade entirely, and yet unmistakably the same man, facing the road in precisely the same way as before. Cole did the math without meaning to, the way your brain sometimes solves a problem you didn't consciously ask it to work on. 11 minutes. That was the gap between mile 4 and mile 8, a distance that, even moving fast, even taking a direct line through terrain that offered no direct line at all given the steep drop and heavy timber between the 2 points, would have required something closer to superhuman effort for any person to cover on foot. He didn't do that math consciously in the moment. He kept driving, telling himself there had to be a second man, maybe a local out for some reason he wasn't aware of. Maybe 2 people who happened to look similar from a distance in bad light. It was only later, replaying it all in his head over gas station coffee and long stretches of empty highway, that the timing bothered him the way it should have bothered him immediately. He didn't do the math until later. That was the part that stuck with him more than almost anything else from that night. The fact that his mind had simply refused, in the moment, to add the numbers together and admit what they meant. The CB radio crackled with static somewhere around mile 9. Nothing coherent coming through, just noise that came and went in waves that matched the thickening fog outside his windows. He turned it down rather than off, mostly for the company of the sound itself, and kept his eyes on the road ahead, on the narrow shoulder with no room to pull over, on the fog rolling down off the ridge in slow, deliberate sheets that made the headlights next to useless beyond 30 feet or so. He didn't see anything at mile 10 or 11, and for a stretch there he let himself believe the whole thing had been exactly what he wanted it to be. 2 strange sightings, easily explained by fatigue and bad light and a long shift. Nothing that needed remembering past tonight's drive. Then mile 12 arrived, and with it, the bridge the clerk had specifically warned him about. The bridge came up out of the fog the way most things did on that grade, sudden and half-formed. A narrow single-lane crossing with low rails on either side, and a drop beneath it Cole had never bothered to look at closely in 6 years of driving this route. His headlights swept across the near end of it as he slowed for the turn, and there, standing at the foot of the bridge exactly where the shoulder widened just enough for a person to stand, was the same man. Cole's hand had already moved toward the headlight switch out of pure habit, the automatic reflex of flashing your brights at someone standing near a road at night, a courtesy so ingrained he barely registered doing it. It was the clerk's voice that stopped him, clear and specific in his memory in a way it hadn't been all night. "Don't flash your headlights at anyone standing near the bridge." He pulled his hand back before it reached the switch, kept the beams steady and low, and forced himself to look straight ahead rather than directly at the figure standing motionless at the edge of his vision. It was in that stretch of road, fog thick enough now that visibility had dropped to almost nothing beyond the hood of the truck, that Cole finally let himself think clearly about what he'd actually been seeing all night. The man at mile 4, the same man at mile 8 11 minutes later, a distance that made no physical sense on foot. The same man now, at mile 12, at the one place Cole had been specifically warned about before he'd even left the gas station. He realized, with a kind of creeping certainty that settled into his chest and stayed there, that the figure had never actually been walking between these points at all. It had simply been standing, in the same posture, in the same stillness, at each location Cole happened to pass, as though it wasn't traveling the road the way a person traveled a road, but existing at points along it, waiting for someone to come through. The CB radio had gone fully to static by then, dead air with no signal underneath it at all, and the fog pressing in against the windows made the cab of the truck feel smaller than it actually was, the only real light in the world reduced to the narrow, fog-choked beam directly ahead. The bridge itself was the only way across without a 40-minute backtrack down the grade and around, and Cole, slowing to a crawl as he approached it, made a decision he still can't fully explain except to say that turning around felt somehow more dangerous than crossing. He kept his eyes forward. He did not look at the man standing at the foot of the bridge, did not slow further than necessary, did not so much as glance sideways as the truck's tires found the worn planks and carried him across in a slow, deliberate crawl that felt like it took considerably longer than the bridge's actual length should have allowed. He resisted, with real physical effort, the urge to check his rearview mirror, some old instinct telling him that whatever was behind him wanted to be looked at, and that looking at it directly would be its own kind of answer. He made it across. The tires found solid gravel again on the far side, and for a moment, Cole let himself believe the worst of it was over. Then he heard the engine. It came from somewhere just off the road, low and steady, an idling sound that had no visible source anywhere in the fog around him. No headlights, no taillights, nothing but the sound itself, matching his own truck's engine pitch so precisely that for a disorienting second he genuinely couldn't tell which sound was his and which wasn't. It stayed with him for several seconds after he'd fully crossed the bridge, keeping pace exactly, neither falling behind nor pulling ahead, and then, all at once, it stopped. Not fading, just gone, the way a sound stops when someone switches off a radio mid-song. He didn't look in the mirror until he was well past the bridge, and when he finally did, the shoulder behind him was empty, no figure, no vehicle, nothing but fog closing back in over the road he'd just crossed. At the gas station, on the far side of the grade, a different clerk than the one who'd warned him mentioned without any prompting from Cole at all, that a man matching roughly that description had been reported missing near that bridge decades earlier and had never been found. She said it lightly, almost as small talk while ringing up his coffee, the way people in small mountain towns sometimes discuss old local tragedies without much weight attached to the telling. Cole didn't ask her to elaborate. He wasn't sure he wanted the details badly enough to hear them. He drove the grade again the next morning, in full daylight, mostly to see it with his own eyes in a light that made sense. The bridge was dry, ordinary, ringed by shoulders far too narrow anywhere along its length for a person to have stood the way Cole remembered seeing him stand. He checked, more than once, pacing off the width himself before getting back in the truck, and there simply wasn't room. There never had been. Cole still takes that road for work, though he's changed a few small habits about how he drives it. He turns the radio off entirely before he reaches mile 12 now, and he doesn't look in the rearview mirror again until he's a full mile past the bridge, no matter how much he wants to check what might be behind him. He says the strangest part of that whole night wasn't the man himself, unsettling as that was. It was the engine, keeping perfect pace with his own for exactly as long as it took to cross, and not 1 second longer. As if whatever it belonged to understood precisely where the bridge ended and knew better than to follow him past it. Not every story here happened in the woods. This one happened at a diner counter, and it's worse for it. Priya woke at exactly 3:17 in the morning to the sound of a floodlight clicking on in the motel parking lot outside her window. Its beam aimed steadily at a dark, second-story window across the lot that the desk clerk had mentioned, almost in passing. Always seemed to catch that light no matter which unit was actually occupied. She checked the time twice before she believed it. She has never learned what happened at that motel, or in that town, and she has never again driven through it without asking specifically for a room on the east side, whether or not the clerk offers one first. It started as nothing more than an overnight stop to save a day on a long drive she'd been dreading for weeks. According to Priya, the whole detour was practical rather than romantic in any way. She was driving cross-country for a job relocation, alone, trying to make good time through a stretch of highway that cut through the mountains rather than around them. And by early evening, the fatigue had built up enough that continuing felt riskier than stopping. She pulled off at a small town whose name she barely registered at the time, drawn mostly by a lit vacancy sign and the promise of a bed that wasn't the reclined driver's seat of her car. She stopped at a diner near the motel first, mostly because she hadn't eaten anything substantial since breakfast, and the laminated menu in the window looked like exactly the kind of comfort food a long drive called for. The place had one waitress working the whole floor, an older woman moving between the handful of occupied tables with the easy efficiency of someone who'd worked there long enough that the job barely required thinking anymore. Priya ordered, made small talk about the drive still ahead of her, and mentioned, only because the waitress asked where she was staying, the name of the motel down the road. The waitress's response came quickly, almost too quickly, delivered in the same easy, conversational tone she'd used for everything else that evening. "Take a room on the east side if they've got one," she said, "not the ones facing the mill." Priya assumed, reasonably enough, that this was some ordinary comment about street noise or a bad view, the kind of local advice you get in any small town about which rooms to avoid. She thanked her for the tip, finished her meal, and drove the short distance to the motel without thinking much more about it. The motel itself was unremarkable. A single-story strip of rooms around a small parking lot, a sign out front buzzing intermittently in a way that suggested a bulb close to failing. The desk clerk, a younger man who looked like he might have been working the overnight shift more out of necessity than preference, checked her in with minimal small talk, right up until she mentioned casually that the waitress at the diner had recommended the East Side. The clerk paused just slightly and repeated the recommendation back to her almost word for word. "East Side's better," he said, in nearly the exact phrasing the waitress had used less than 20 minutes earlier. Priya didn't think much of it in the moment. Tired enough from the drive that she was mostly focused on getting to her room and calling her mother before the signal, already weak this far off the interstate, dropped out entirely for the night. It was only after she'd hung up, lying in the unfamiliar dark of a cheap motel room, that the coincidence started to bother her the way it should have bothered her earlier. Two different people, a waitress at a diner and a desk clerk who likely didn't know her at all, using almost exactly the same 12 words to describe the same preference. People don't usually land on identical phrasing like that by accident. She didn't think about it long enough to really unpack why it unsettled her. She was asleep within the hour, worn out from the drive. The thought filed away somewhere she didn't plan on revisiting. She woke at 3:17 to the sound of a floodlight clicking on somewhere outside her window. A sharp mechanical click followed by a sudden wash of white light, bright enough to leak around the edges of the motel curtains. She checked the clock on her phone twice, an old habit from being startled awake, and confirmed the time before easing the curtain aside to look. The light came from a floodlight mounted on a pole near the far end of the parking lot, and it was aimed, steadily and specifically, at a dark second-story window on the opposite side of the building, a section of the motel that, as far as she could tell, was entirely unoccupied that night. There was no one near the switch, no maintenance worker checking the grounds, nothing that offered an ordinary explanation for why the light would activate on its own at that specific hour, aimed at that specific window. She watched it for a while, long enough to feel foolish for staring at a parking lot floodlight in the middle of the night, before finally letting the curtain fall back into place and returning to bed, telling herself it was probably on some kind of automatic timer that hadn't been reset properly, or a motion sensor triggered by an animal she simply hadn't been able to see. She mentioned it the next morning at breakfast back at the diner, mostly as a piece of small talk with the same waitress from the night before, expecting maybe a laugh about the motel's finicky wiring. Instead, a mechanic sitting a few stools down, someone Priya hadn't spoken to at all, glanced over and said, almost automatically, "East Side's better," before visibly catching himself mid-sentence and turning his attention back to his coffee like he hadn't meant to say anything at all. The waitress didn't react beyond a slight tightening around her eyes, refilling Priya's cup without comment, and Priya sat there a long moment, 3 different strangers now, all circling the exact same phrase, all reacting with the same small, practiced discomfort whenever the subject came up even slightly sideways. That should have been the end of it. One strange morning in an otherwise unremarkable small town. A coincidence of local phrasing that Priya could have driven away from and mostly forgotten. It wasn't. Her car, parked outside the motel that morning, refused to start no matter how many times she turned the key, and the only mechanic in town, the same man who'd blurted out the East Side phrase without meaning to, told her flatly that he couldn't get to it until later, no matter how she framed the urgency of her situation, leaving her stuck in that small town for at least one more night she hadn't planned on spending there at all. The mechanic wouldn't budge on the timing, not for extra money, not for Priya explaining she had a job waiting on the other side of the mountains and no real slack left in her schedule. He looked at the car, popped the hood, said something vague about the starter, and told her 8 o'clock, same as always, in a tone that made it clear the number wasn't up for negotiation. Priya spent most of that unplanned day wandering the small main street, past a closed mill at the edge of town that sat behind a rusted chain-link fence, its windows dark and mostly intact, despite what looked like decades of disuse, and past a sheriff's office that appeared, every time she walked by it, to be completely dark inside. She went back to the motel that afternoon for the same room, the desk clerk not needing to be told which side she wanted this time, and killed the rest of the daylight hours reading in a chair by the window, glancing periodically at the mill in the distance without quite admitting to herself why she kept looking at it. It sat there, unremarkable in the ordinary daylight sense, the kind of abandoned industrial building you'd find at the edge of 100 small towns across that stretch of Appalachia. Nothing about its physical presence suggesting anything beyond an economic story that had played out decades earlier and simply never been cleaned up after. She ate dinner at the diner again that evening, mostly because it was the only real option in town, and because some part of her, tired of tiptoeing around the subject, decided she wanted an actual answer rather than another accidental echo of the same 12 words. She asked the waitress directly, this time, what exactly had happened at the mill. The question landed in the diner with a silence that stretched a beat longer than it should have, long enough that Priya noticed the two other customers at the counter go quiet as well, without either of them turning to look at her directly. The waitress didn't answer. She simply reached for the coffee pot and refilled Priya's cup, unprompted, her expression carefully neutral, and moved on to check the other tables as though the question had simply evaporated the moment it left Priya's mouth. Priya didn't push further. She understood, in the particular way you understand things in small towns without anyone spelling it out for you, that this was as close to an answer as she was going to get, and that whatever had happened at that mill was something the town had collectively decided, at some point, not to discuss with outsiders, or possibly not to discuss with each other either. Back at the motel that night, in the same east-facing room, she found herself unable to sleep as easily as the first night, some part of her waiting, without wanting to admit it, for the floodlight to click on again at the same hour. It did, right on schedule, the mechanical click followed by that same wash of white light, steady and specific, aimed at the same dark window on the mill-facing side of the building. This time, she didn't get up to look. She lay in bed with her eyes closed, listening to the low electrical hum of the light through the wall, and made a conscious effort not to turn toward the window at all, not to give in to the same curiosity that had pulled her out of bed the night before. She fell asleep eventually, and when she woke the next morning, her car started on the first try, the engine turning over smoothly as though nothing had ever been wrong with it. She didn't ask the mechanic what he'd actually done to fix it. She wasn't sure she wanted an answer that would only raise more questions than it resolved. While she was packing the car, she noticed a community bulletin board mounted near the diner's entrance, the kind of cluttered cork surface every small town seems to keep, layered with old flyers for church suppers and lost pets and yard sales long since concluded. Tucked near the bottom, faded almost past legibility, was a flyer for what appeared to be a mill closure event, decades old by the look of the paper and the style of the print. Several names on it, listed presumably as attendees or organizers, had been blacked out by hand, not printed over or professionally redacted, but scratched out crudely with what looked like the same pen, all at once, sometime long after the flyer had first been posted. As she pulled out of town that morning, she passed the sheriff's office and found it open for the first time since she'd arrived. Lights on inside. A deputy standing out front with a coffee cup in hand. He nodded at her as she drove past, an easy, unbothered nod that carried none of the curiosity she might have expected from a stranger's car leaving town after an unplanned two-night stay. It was the nod of someone who already knew she was leaving, and why, without needing to ask a single question about it. Priya never learned what happened at that mill, and she has stopped trying to guess at the specifics, mostly because guessing felt disrespectful to whatever the town had clearly decided, collectively and a long time ago, was not hers to know. She only knows this now. If she ever finds herself passing through that particular stretch of highway again, she'll ask for an east side room the moment she checks in, without waiting to be told. And she won't ask the diner's waitress a single question she doesn't already expect to go unanswered. The strangest part of the whole trip, she says, wasn't the floodlight itself, or the blacked-out names, or even the silence that fell over the diner counter when she finally asked her question out loud. It was the deputy's nod on her way out of town, easy and unsurprised, as though her whole strange visit had been something the town had simply been waiting to see, play out exactly the way it always did. This next one comes from a family that still owns the land and still won't sell it, no matter what an agent might offer them for the acreage. Teresa found the figure in the photograph on her third day of sorting through her grandfather's things. A shape standing at the tree line behind him in a faded snapshot from sometime in the 70s. And she was certain, absolutely certain, that it hadn't been there the last time she'd looked at that same photo years earlier, back when her grandfather was still alive to ask about it. She never sold the land after that week, though she also never walks past the back fence after dark, not once, not for any reason. It started as an ordinary task, the kind any family has to do eventually, clearing out a house that had belonged to someone who was gone now and wasn't coming back to claim any of it. According to Teresa, her grandfather's cabin had sat on the same wooded parcel for as long as anyone in the family could remember, passed down through a chain of ownership nobody had ever formally documented, the kind of property that simply belonged to the family the way a name belonged to it. She'd spent a week of vacation time clearing it out after his passing, sorting decades of accumulated belongings into what could be kept, sold, or thrown away, mostly alone, except for occasional visits from a neighbor down the road who'd known her grandfather for most of his life. The work itself was ordinary and a little melancholy, the way sorting through a dead relative's home always is. Boxes of tools in the shed that hadn't been touched in years, closets full of clothes that still smelled faintly of him, a kitchen stocked with mismatched dishware collected over decades. She restarted the old generator on her first afternoon there, mostly out of necessity since the cabin's connection to the grid had never been especially reliable, and spent long stretches of each day airing out rooms that had gone stale with disuse. It was on the third afternoon, going through a box of family photographs stored in the back of a closet, that she found the album from the 70s, its pages brittle and slightly yellowed, filled with snapshots of her grandfather younger than she'd ever really pictured him, standing in front of the same cabin, the same tree line, the same stretch of land she was currently sitting in the middle of. She flipped through slowly, recognizing the property in every frame, the small differences in the landscape over the decades interesting to her in a mild, nostalgic way. One photo stopped her cold. It showed her grandfather standing near the edge of the yard, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. The tree line behind him dense and shadowed the way it always was in late afternoon light. Standing at that tree line, half obscured by shadow but unmistakably present, was a shape she was almost certain hadn't been in that photograph before. She sat with it a long moment, turning the album toward better light, trying to talk herself into believing it was a trick of old film grain or a shadow cast by a tree branch. The shape didn't resolve into anything so simple. It had the general proportion of a person, standing still, facing the camera the same way her grandfather was. She set the album aside, unsettled in a way she couldn't fully articulate, and went back to her sorting, telling herself she was imagining details that weren't really there, the kind of thing tired eyes do after a long day of unfamiliar, emotionally heavy work. That evening, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the woods settle into their evening quiet, she heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across the porch boards near the far end, the kind of sound a person makes walking casually rather than sneaking. She assumed, reasonably enough, that it was the neighbor's dog, an animal that wandered freely between properties out here and had visited a few times already that week, sniffing curiously at the porch steps before wandering off again. She checked anyway, stepping outside with a flashlight, and found nothing. No dog, no obvious source for the sound, just the ordinary dark of the yard stretching toward the tree line at its edge. She told herself the porch boards were simply old, the kind of structure that creaked and shifted on its own as temperatures dropped in the evening, and went back inside, deciding not to think too hard about it. The footsteps returned the following evening, and this time, the pattern bothered her in a way the first instance hadn't. She was sitting inside, sorting through another box near the fireplace, and the footsteps started up again on the porch, slow and even, the same casual pace as before. She stopped moving to listen more closely, holding her breath without quite meaning to, and the footsteps stopped at almost the exact same moment, as though whatever was making them had noticed her stillness and matched it. She told herself this was coincidence, that old boards settling under changing temperature simply happened to align with her own pauses by chance, a loose plank finding its natural resting point at roughly the same interval each time. She tried again a few minutes later, deliberately holding her breath to test the theory, and the footsteps stopped again, precisely, twice in a row, a level of precision that a loose board settling under thermal stress had no reasonable way of producing. She sat with that thought a long while that night, the photograph from the album still resting on the counter where she'd left it, and found herself returning to it before bed, studying the shape at the tree line one more time under the glow of a single lamp. She told herself, closing the album and setting it aside for the second time that day, that the porch board was simply loose, that old cabins made these kinds of sounds all the time, that there was nothing in either the photograph or the footsteps that couldn't be explained by ordinary means if she thought about it clearly enough in daylight. Loose boards, she would come to understand before the week was over, don't usually wait for you to be quiet before they decide to stop. The neighbor stopped by 2 days later to help her move a heavy dresser out of the back bedroom, an older man who'd lived down the road from her grandfather for most of both their lives, and had known the property nearly as long as her grandfather had owned it. He noticed the photo album sitting open on the counter while they took a break for coffee, glanced at it out of idle curiosity, and went quiet in a way that told Teresa immediately she wasn't the only one who'd noticed something in that particular photograph. He didn't say much at first, just studied the shape at the tree line for a long moment, before setting the album back down carefully, as though handling something more fragile than old paper. When he finally spoke, it was to tell her, plainly and without much elaboration, not to walk past the back fence line after dark. He said it the same way, he mentioned, that he'd once told her grandfather the exact same thing, years earlier, and that her grandfather had never done it either, not once in all the decades he'd owned that land. He didn't explain why. He didn't offer a story or a reason. He simply repeated the instruction once more, firmly, before changing the subject back to the dresser they were supposed to be moving. Teresa didn't push him for more, sensing, the way she'd sensed with the diner waitress days earlier in an unrelated story she hadn't yet heard, that some questions in small communities carried weight that made people uncomfortable enough to simply decline answering rather than lie outright. She thanked him for the warning, helped finish moving the furniture, and spent the rest of that afternoon going through more of the old photographs with a closer, more deliberate eye than she'd used before. What she found unsettled her more than the first photo had. Album after album, spanning different decades of her grandfather's life on that land, showed the same tree line at the back of the property, and in several of them, spaced years apart, the same shape was visible at the same general spot along that boundary. Never closer to the cabin, never further away. Always at that particular stretch of fence line, present in some photographs and absent in others, appearing and disappearing across the decades without any pattern she could identify. That evening, a storm rolled in without much warning. Heavy rain hammering the tin roof and knocking out the cabin's single phone line entirely, leaving her without any way to call anyone, even if she'd wanted to. The nearest neighbor, the same man who'd warned her earlier that day, lived a 15-minute drive down a road that flooded easily in weather like this, effectively cutting her off from any real assistance until the storm passed. The footsteps came back that night, but they were different this time. Rather than pacing along one section of the porch the way they had before, they moved in a full, deliberate circle around the entire structure, slow and unhurried, before finally stopping directly opposite the back fence line, the exact spot where the shape had appeared, again and again, across decades of family photographs. Then, all at once, silence, complete and total, the kind that felt less like an absence of sound and more like something holding perfectly still. Teresa stayed inside with every light in the cabin turned on, resisting every instinct that told her to check the window facing the fence line, resisting the urge to confirm with her own eyes whatever had been circling the porch. She waited instead, the way you wait out a storm you can't do anything about, until the gray light of early morning finally filtered through the curtains, and the woods outside settled back into something approximating ordinary quiet. In the morning, checking the back fence out of a compulsion she couldn't quite resist despite everything she'd been told, she found the gate standing open. It had been rusted shut for years, as far as she knew, closed and sealed the entire time she'd been visiting the property throughout her life. The chain that secured it was still looped through the latch, still locked, exactly as it should have been. The gate itself simply stood open regardless, swung wide on hinges that shouldn't have moved at all, given how thoroughly rusted the mechanism appeared to be. She mentioned it to the neighbor later that day, expecting some reaction of alarm or concern, and instead received only a small, resigned nod, the kind of response you give to something you've heard about before and have simply learned to accept as part of a place's ordinary strangeness. "That's about right for that fence," he said, offering to help her fix the chain properly rather than explaining anything further. And Teresa understood, watching him work without asking a single follow-up question, that this was as complete an answer as she was ever going to receive. She decided, by the end of that week, not to sell the land after all. A choice she still can't fully explain in practical terms, given how rarely she visits now, compared to how often her grandfather once had. She fixed the fence properly, with her neighbor's help, but she has never used the back gate since, not once, and she keeps the old photo albums in a drawer now, rather than displayed on the wall the way her grandfather once kept them. She still doesn't know, and has stopped trying to guess, whether whatever appears at that tree line follows the land itself, or follows something particular about her family that's tied to it across generations. She only knows that her grandfather never asked the question either, choosing instead, the same as she eventually chose, to simply respect a boundary he'd never fully understood, and never once crossed after dark in all the years he lived there. The story after that comes from a hunter who has not been back since, not to that stretch of woods, not to that particular creek crossing, no matter how many seasons have passed. Jesse heard his wife's voice call his name from somewhere deep in the tree line below his stand, clear enough to make out every syllable, warm enough to sound exactly like her. And for one full second his hand was already reaching for the radio to ask her what on earth she was doing 3 hours from home in the middle of a hunting trip she had no way of even knowing the location of. He has never hunted that particular stand alone since, and he has never told his wife the full details of what he heard that morning, only the broad shape of it, enough to explain why he doesn't like that stretch of woods anymore without explaining exactly why. It started as nothing more than an annual trip with his uncle, the kind they'd taken together for years, on land the family had hunted for longer than either of them had been alive. According to Jesse, the trip had gone the way most of their trips went for the first day and a half. Unremarkable in the best possible sense, the two of them tracking a deer trail near a creek crossing they'd used every season for as long as he could remember. They'd loaded gear into the truck the afternoon before, checked their radios out of habit rather than necessity, and crossed the ford at the usual spot early the next morning, before settling into separate tree stands a few hundred yards apart, close enough to reach each other quickly if needed, far enough apart to each have their own quiet stretch of woods to watch. The morning started well. Jesse was in his stand well before first light, the cold sharp enough to make his breath visible, gloved hands wrapped around a rifle that felt, as it always did on these trips, like an extension of some older, calmer part of himself. Dead leaves crunched somewhere below him periodically, the ordinary sounds of a forest waking up, birds beginning to call as the sky lightened by degrees. The voice came a little after 7, calling his name from somewhere downhill, close enough that his first instinct was to assume his uncle's radio had cut through with some kind of odd static distortion. He checked the radio clipped to his vest and found no recent transmission logged, no indication his uncle had said anything at all. He blamed the wind instead, telling himself the hollow below his stand sometimes carried sound in strange, amplified ways, bending ordinary noises into something that only sounded like a voice if you were primed to expect one. It came again a few minutes later, closer this time, and this time there was no mistaking the specific tone underneath it, the particular warmth and rhythm that belonged unmistakably to his wife rather than to any generic voice the wind might have conjured. It said something only she would think to say, a small private joke between them that had no business being known by anyone else, let alone spoken from the middle of a forest 3 hours from where she should have been at that exact moment. He almost radioed his uncle right then, some part of him wanting confirmation that he wasn't imagining things, wanting another human voice to anchor him back to something ordinary. He stopped himself before pressing the button, some instinct he still can't fully name telling him that broadcasting his confusion over an open channel wasn't the right move. Not yet. Not until he understood a little more about what he was actually dealing with. He sat with that uncertainty through the rest of the morning, watching the tree line below more carefully than he watched for deer, the voice not returning again for several hours, long enough that he'd nearly convinced himself it had been some strange trick of acoustics and an overactive imagination working together against him. It was near midday, meeting back up with his uncle at the truck for lunch, that Jesse finally mentioned what he'd heard, framing it carefully, testing the waters before committing to how seriously he wanted to take it himself. His uncle's reaction told him everything he needed to know about how seriously he should be taking it. The older man went quiet, set down the sandwich he'd been eating, and repeated a warning he'd apparently given Jesse before, though in a much lighter tone, something about sound carrying wrong out in these woods, not meant seriously the first time it was said. This time, there was nothing light about it. "Don't answer," his uncle said, "and don't cross that creek a second time after dark, not tonight, not on this trip." He didn't offer much explanation beyond that. Just the same firm, practical tone Jesse had heard from other older men in his life when they were passing along something they'd learned the hard way, and didn't feel like justifying with a full story. They split up again that afternoon, tracking the same deer trail from slightly different angles, radios checked and working properly this time, at least at first. It was somewhere in the mid-afternoon that Jesse's radio started losing signal intermittently, the hollow's terrain apparently interfering with reception in ways it hadn't earlier in the day, static, swallowing half of whatever his uncle tried to say to him each time he checked in. Daylight was running out faster than either of them had planned for. The kind of afternoon that gets away from you when you're focused on tracking rather than watching the clock. And it was crossing back over the creek ford, alone, ahead of his uncle by a few minutes, that Jesse noticed something that made him stop cold in the shallow water. A second set of boot tracks crossed the ford directly behind his own, close enough to overlap in places, matching his tread pattern almost exactly. The same brand of boot, the same general size, but slightly larger, as though someone wearing nearly identical boots had followed his exact path across the water, only a few minutes behind him. He stood in the cold water a long moment, staring down at the overlapping prints, trying to work out an explanation that made the discovery feel less unsettling than it actually was. He almost radioed back before he stopped himself. He still isn't sure, even now, what exactly made him hesitate. Jesse stood in that shallow water long enough for the cold to work its way through his boots before he finally moved on, telling himself the second set of tracks belonged to his uncle, that somehow they'd crossed paths without either of them noticing, that the size difference was simply an illusion created by the mud and the angle of the afternoon light. He knew, even as he told himself this, that his uncle's boots were a different brand entirely, worn down at a different point in the heel, nothing like the tracks he'd just found pressed into the creek bank behind his own. He caught up with his uncle a short while later near the base of the ridge, and neither of them said much at first, both of them apparently absorbed in their own private unease about how the day had gone. It was Jesse who finally brought up the tracks, describing them as evenly as he could manage, watching his uncle's expression carefully for whatever reaction might follow. His uncle didn't offer much beyond a tightening around his eyes, a brief pause before he suggested, without much conviction, that maybe another hunter had used the same ford earlier in the day. Neither of them believed it, and neither of them said so out loud. Daylight was fading faster than either of them wanted by the time they started making their way back toward the truck, the two of them staying closer together now than they had for most of the trip, an unspoken agreement neither needed to voice directly. It was somewhere in that last stretch, dusk settling heavy and blue over the treetops, that the voice came again, closer than it had been that morning, using Jesse's name in his wife's exact tone, and this time something in the delivery had shifted subtly toward a specific, private detail Jesse recognized immediately. It used her laugh. Not just her voice saying his name, but the small, particular laugh she gave afterward, the one that followed almost every time she teased him about something. A sound so specific and so hers that hearing it detached from her entirely, floating out from somewhere in the darkening trees, sent something cold through Jesse's chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. He did not answer. He moved instead, quickly and deliberately, toward the sound of his uncle's actual voice a few yards ahead, anchoring himself to something real rather than risk responding to something that only sounded real. His uncle heard it too, this time unmistakably, and neither of them discussed it in the moment. They simply picked up their pace, moving with the kind of urgency that doesn't require explanation between two people who both understand, without saying so, that getting back to the truck matters more right now than finishing the day's hunt properly. They crossed the creek together this time, side by side, refusing to look back at the tree line, despite the voice calling out both their names now, Jesse's and his uncle's, in quick succession, as though testing which one of them might respond first. Neither of them did. They kept their eyes forward, crossed the water quickly, and didn't stop moving until the truck came into view through the last stretch of trees, its familiar shape more welcome than either of them would normally admit out loud. The next morning, before heading out for one final short walk to check a trail camera they'd set earlier in the trip, Jesse's uncle found a third set of tracks near the exact spot where the voice had first seemed to originate the previous day. Smaller than either of their own prints, and barefoot despite the cold, pressed into soft ground with no other marks leading to or away from them, as though whatever left them had simply stood in that one spot and then stopped existing there entirely. Neither of them said much about the tracks beyond confirming, quietly, that neither of them had made them. Jesse's uncle, a man who had hunted that land his entire life and had never once, in Jesse's memory, seemed genuinely unsettled by anything the woods might produce, made it clear before they packed up that he had no interest in hunting that particular section again. He suggested without much elaboration that they try a different ridge the following season, a suggestion Jesse agreed to immediately, neither of them needing to discuss the reasoning any further than that. Jesse hasn't crossed that particular ford after 4 in the afternoon since, a habit he describes to anyone who asks as simply practical, a matter of daylight and timing rather than anything approaching superstition, though he's aware, even as he says it, that the explanation doesn't quite cover the full truth of why he avoids it. He hasn't hunted that specific stand alone again either, always making sure someone else is with him now. A small, quiet adjustment to his routine that he's never had to justify to anyone, because nobody's ever pushed hard enough to ask. He still doesn't know how, whatever he heard that day managed to reproduce his wife's laugh with that level of precision. A sound so specific and personal that it shouldn't have been reproducible by anything except her. He has never told her the full story, only the broad outline. Enough to explain his new caution about that stretch of woods without giving her the specific detail that still bothers him most when he thinks about it late at night. He isn't sure, even now, what telling her the whole truth would actually accomplish, beyond making something that already feels unfinished feel somehow more permanent. This one is the search that never got a clean answer, the kind of story that circulates quietly among search and rescue volunteers long after the official case file has been closed. Ben's team got a perfect 3-whistle response from Grid Section 7 on the second morning of the search, the exact search code for a positive find, coming from a stretch of canyon terrain marked on every map at command as unreachable without technical climbing gear, and no team assigned anywhere near that section had made a sound. He still volunteers for searches today, though he hasn't taken a canyon assignment since, and command has stopped asking him why. It started, like most searches do, as a straightforward case. A hiker overdue by less than a day on a trail with generally reliable cell coverage, the kind of situation that resolves itself more often than not, with nothing more dramatic than a person who simply lost track of time. According to Ben, who had volunteered on search efforts before and considered himself reasonably experienced with how these operations usually unfolded, the first day felt almost routine, despite the obvious seriousness everyone brought to the work. He checked in at the command tent early that morning, was assigned a grid section along with 2 other volunteers, and spent a few minutes testing radios and marking a paper map, since the digital overlay command was using had been glitching intermittently since the search began. The search itself moved the way these things typically do. Teams spread across assigned grid sections, working methodical patterns through dense terrain, calling out periodically and listening for any response. Ben's section that first day covered a relatively accessible stretch of trail and adjacent woods, nothing especially difficult, and the day passed without any significant developments beyond the accumulation of tired legs and the slow, grinding awareness that the missing hiker, a woman in her late 20s who'd set out for what should have been a manageable day hike, had now been missing longer than anyone had initially expected. It was the second morning. Teams redeployed to fresh sections based on overnight analysis of probable routes that Ben's team first heard the whistle from Section 7, a stretch of canyon terrain that Command had specifically flagged as requiring rope access, well beyond anything the missing hiker would have attempted, given her stated plans and equipment. 3 short blasts, clean and correct, the exact code his team had been briefed to listen for. His team leader radioed command immediately, assuming hopefully that the missing hiker herself had somehow found her way into that canyon and was signaling for help. Command redirected resources toward Section 7 with a cautious optimism that Ben remembers clearly. The particular lift in everyone's mood that comes with the first real sign of progress after a long stretch of nothing. It took another whistle blast, precisely on cue, when a team member below whistled back to confirm position, for the first small crack of doubt to enter Ben's thinking. The response came exactly when it should have, exactly the way protocol dictated, and something about that precision nagged at him even as the rest of the team treated it as good news. For a few hours, it did feel like good news, the whole search effort reorienting itself around the belief that the hiker had been located, even if her exact position within the canyon remained unclear given the technical terrain separating the search teams from wherever the whistle originated. Nobody, in that stretch of cautious optimism, stopped to seriously ask how a hiker with no climbing gear and no stated intention of entering that section could possibly have ended up there in the first place. Ben didn't ask it himself, not out loud, though he noted the thought and set it aside the way you set aside a worry that doesn't fit comfortably into a situation everyone else seems relieved about. That afternoon, a piece of gear turned up, a water bottle belonging to the missing hiker, found resting upright on a boulder at the edge of Section 7, cap screwed on properly, positioned facing the main trail as though deliberately placed there for someone to find rather than dropped in the chaos of an accident or a fall. The retired ranger consulting on the search that week, a man Ben had worked alongside on a few previous efforts and trusted for his steady, unflappable demeanor, examined the water bottle for a long moment before quietly telling Ben not to trust any further whistle responses that came out of that particular canyon. He didn't explain the warning beyond that single sentence, delivered in a tone flat enough that Ben understood immediately it wasn't meant as idle caution. Ben carried the warning with him through the rest of that day's search, the whistle continuing to answer intermittently whenever a team called into the canyon, always with the correct code, always at the correct interval, a level of consistency that started to feel less like a sign of survival and more like something following a script it had learned very precisely. A storm rolled in that evening, grounding the helicopter spotter who'd been providing aerial support and cutting radio range across roughly half the search grid, narrowing the team's effective search capacity right as command's attention had become increasingly focused on the canyon section. Ben remembers the storm arriving with an almost deliberate sense of timing, though he's careful, even now, retelling the story, not to overstate that impression as anything more than an uneasy feeling rather than an actual fact. It felt, for a few hours that day, like genuinely good news. Nobody stopped to ask how she'd have gotten in there in the first place. A second item turned up the following day, further into Section 7 than the water bottle had been, deep enough into the technical terrain that reaching it required 2 experienced climbers roped in from the ridge above, a task that ate up most of the morning and left the rest of the search effort effectively paused while command waited on the result. It was a boot, matching the hiker's known gear exactly, sitting upright on a narrow ledge with no scuff marks or drag trails leading to it, positioned with the same unsettling neatness as the water bottle before it. Ben did the math on that one himself, standing at the command tent while the climbers radioed their findings back down. The distance between where the water bottle had been found and where the boot now sat was significant, technical terrain requiring careful, deliberate movement, even for a trained climber with proper gear. the amount of time that had passed since anyone had last confirmed a genuine sighting of the missing hiker didn't come close to matching the amount of time it would reasonably take an untrained, unequipped person to cover that ground, assuming she'd even been capable of surviving there long enough to attempt it. The retired ranger, standing nearby when the boot's location was radioed in, didn't say much, though Ben noticed him go very still. The particular stillness of someone confirming a suspicion he'd rather not have had confirmed. Nobody at command openly said the items were being placed rather than lost, but the shift in mood was unmistakable. The earlier cautious optimism curdling into something quieter and more careful. A collective unwillingness to say out loud what several people were clearly starting to think. That evening, Ben's team was back on the canyon rim, calling into Section 7 at set intervals as part of the ongoing effort. And it was during one of these routine calls that the whistle responded differently than it had before. 3 short blasts, the correct code, followed by something that had never happened in 2 full days of these exchanges. His own name, called out clearly from somewhere deep in the canyon, using the exact tone and cadence of the search whistle code itself, as though whatever was down there had learned not just the protocol but had also learned, somehow, who specifically was calling into it each time. He stood frozen for a long moment, his team leader glancing over at him with a question he didn't yet have the words to answer. The missing hiker had no way of knowing Ben's name. Nobody on any team had used names over the whistle exchanges at any point during the search. The entire protocol built specifically around neutral, standardized signals precisely to avoid this kind of confusion. Whatever had just called out to him from Section 7 had used information it had no legitimate way of possessing. He didn't answer. He didn't call back, didn't attempt the standard confirmation whistle his team leader was already gesturing for him to try. He radioed command instead, his voice steadier than he actually felt, and asked them to check something for him, a request he framed as carefully and clinically as he could manage given the circumstances, mostly because he wasn't yet ready to say out loud exactly what he suspected they might find. He asked them to check the volunteer roster against anyone who might have been in a position to overhear his name being used near the canyon rim earlier that day, a request that, even as he made it, felt thin and unconvincing even to himself. He didn't really believe it was a matter of someone overhearing anything. He just needed a version of the question that sounded reasonable enough to ask over an open channel without alarming the rest of command any further than they already were. The response from command took longer than he expected, and when it finally came back, it offered nothing conclusive either way. No record of anyone having used his name near the canyon that day. No explanation beyond a vague acknowledgement that they'd look into it further once the search's immediate priorities allowed for it. Ben understood, hearing the flat, careful tone in the dispatcher's voice, that nobody at command had a real answer either. Only the same uneasy absence of one that he'd been carrying himself since the whistle first said his name. He stayed on the canyon rim through the rest of that evening's shift, watching the storm clouds building steadily over the ridgeline. Cold rain, starting in scattered heavy drops that would soon become the steady downpour that grounded the helicopter spotter entirely. He didn't call into Section 7 again that night. Neither did anyone else on his team, an unspoken agreement settling over the group without any of them needing to discuss it directly. He didn't answer his name. He radioed command instead and asked them to check something for him. A small, careful step back from a threshold he understood. Without fully articulating it to himself, he had come dangerously close to crossing. Command made the call that evening to pull all teams back from the Section 7 entirely for the night, citing revised protocol given the technical risk of the terrain and worsening weather. Though Ben suspected, watching the exchange play out at the command tent, that the decision had less to do with official risk assessment and more to do with an unspoken consensus nobody wanted to state plainly out loud. Nobody argued the point. The teams withdrew to the main camp, tents set up along the accessible ridge, and settled in for what promised to be a long, uneasy night, given everything the last 2 days had produced. The whistle didn't stop just because the search teams had. It continued through the night, audible even from camp when the wind shifted the right way, coming at steady, regular intervals from somewhere deep in the canyon below. The same clean 3-blast pattern repeating with a patience that felt, to everyone within earshot, less like a person signaling for rescue, and more like something simply confirming it was still there. Ben lay awake through most of it, listening along with several other volunteers who'd given up any pretense of sleeping. None of them saying much, all of them tracking the same sound without needing to discuss what they each privately suspected it meant. It stopped only at first light, the whistle cutting off abruptly rather than fading, the silence that followed somehow more unsettling than the sound itself had been. Search operations resumed that morning with a caution that hadn't been present on the first 2 days, teams moving more carefully, radio discipline tighter. Section 7 left conspicuously unassigned on the day's grid despite it being, technically, the most recently active lead the search had produced. The missing hiker was found later that same morning, alive, disoriented, and dehydrated, in a section of the trail system entirely unrelated to the canyon, a stretch of terrain easily accessible on foot and consistent with the equipment and plans she'd originally set out with. She had no memory, when questioned gently by the medical team who reached her first, of ever having been near Section 7. No recollection of losing her water bottle or her boot. No account that matched anything the search effort had spent the last 2 days chasing through that particular stretch of canyon. The gear items recovered from Section 7 were logged into evidence as a matter of procedure, though nothing about their condition offered any comfortable explanation for how they'd ended up where they had. Neither item showed the kind of weathering or exposure damage that should have accumulated over several days outdoors. The boots stitching intact and unworn. The water bottle, when opened, still containing water clean enough that nobody on the evidence team could quite bring themselves to comment on it directly. Ben looked over the search log a few days later, once the immediate operation had wound down and paperwork had caught up with the actual timeline of events. He found, at the exact time his name had been called from Section 7 that second evening, a blank entry in the radio log, the timestamp present and accounted for, the actual transmission itself entirely absent from the recording, as though something had occupied that specific moment in the record without leaving behind anything that could actually be replayed or reviewed. He mentioned it to the retired ranger before the man left the search area for good, and received, in response, only a slow nod and no further elaboration. The same kind of quiet acknowledgement Ben had come to expect from him over the preceding days. Neither of them discussed it beyond that single exchange, and Ben understood, watching the older man pack up his gear and head toward his truck, that this was as close to a shared understanding as either of them was likely to reach. Ben still volunteers for search efforts today, drawn back each time by the same sense of purpose that brought him into the work originally, the genuine relief of finding someone alive outweighing, in his mind, whatever unresolved unease still lingers from that particular search. He simply doesn't take section assignments in canyon terrain anymore, a preference he's stated plainly enough times that command has stopped asking him to justify it, filing his reluctance away as one of those small, personal quirks that every long-serving volunteer eventually develops without needing a full explanation attached to it. This next account follows an old coal road that the county stopped maintaining decades ago, gated now and mostly forgotten except by the handful of workers still occasionally sent out to check on infrastructure the county technically still owns. Darrell heard the clanking a little past the second switchback, unmistakable and rhythmic. The sound of metal striking metal in a cadence that belonged to actual mining work, rather than anything a sealed, abandoned shaft should still be capable of producing 40 years after the last crew walked out of it. He still works for the county, but he doesn't take work orders for that particular road anymore, and nobody has ever pushed him hard enough to explain why. It started as nothing more than a routine assignment, a reported washed-out culvert on a haul road the county had kept gated and mostly forgotten for decades. According to Darrell, the work order itself was unremarkable, the kind of low-priority maintenance task that got assigned whenever someone happened to notice a problem on county-owned land that technically still required upkeep, even though nobody used the road anymore beyond the occasional utility check. He drove out early that morning with a paper copy of the order on the passenger seat, unlocked the gate at the base of the grade, and started up the narrow, overgrown, single-lane road at a careful pace, mindful of the terrain even before he'd seen anything worth worrying about. The grade itself was steep and poorly maintained, cut directly into the hillside decades earlier when the mine had still been active, wide enough for a single vehicle with almost no shoulder to speak of on either side. Rusted equipment sat abandoned at intervals along the route, left exactly where it had been decades ago when the operation shut down, the kind of industrial decay that Darrell had encountered plenty of times before in his years working for the county, and had learned not to find particularly unsettling on its own. The clanking started somewhere around the second switchback, a sound distinct enough from the ordinary creaks and groans of an old vehicle navigating rough terrain that Darrell noticed it immediately, though his first instinct was to assume it was settling equipment, loose sheet metal shifting in the wind, or some other mundane structural noise common to abandoned industrial sites this old. He logged it mentally as exactly that, structural noise consistent with the site's age, and continued driving toward the reported culvert without giving it much further thought. The sound repeated a short while later, and this time the rhythm bothered him in a way pure structural noise shouldn't have. It wasn't random, the way wind-driven metal usually sounded, erratic and unpredictable in its timing. It had a consistency to it, a cadence that matched, unmistakably, the working rhythm of actual mining labor, the kind of steady, repetitive strike Darrell had heard described by older co-workers who'd grown up around mining operations before most of them shut down for good. He'd worked around old equipment his entire career, long enough to know the difference between wind-moving loose metal and something that sounded distinctly like it was keeping a beat. He continued toward the culvert regardless, telling himself the sound, whatever its actual source, wasn't his primary concern that day, and reached the reported washed-out section without further incident, spending a reasonable stretch of time documenting the damage with photographs for the follow-up crew that would eventually need to complete the actual repair work. The clanking continued intermittently throughout this process, distant enough now that he could mostly set it aside as background noise while he focused on the task at hand. It was on his way back down the grade, the light beginning to shift toward the grayer tones of an early storm front, moving in faster than the forecast had suggested, that Darrell remembered a warning an older co-worker had given him before he'd left the yard that morning. "Don't go past the third switchback once the light starts to change," the man had said, adding, almost as an afterthought, that this held true, regardless of what the county's current maps claimed was, or wasn't, still standing out there. Darrell hadn't thought much of the warning at the time, filing it away as one of those small, superstitious habits older workers sometimes carried without a fully articulated reason behind them. He thought about it more seriously now, watching the light overhead shift steadily grayer, the storm front clearly arriving faster than expected, right as his truck's radio, which had maintained a steady connection to the county channel for most of the morning, dropped into complete silence. No static, no signal, nothing at all. The narrow grade offered no real alternative route back to the gate beyond the same single-lane road he'd driven in on, and Darrell found himself approaching the third switchback with a level of attention he hadn't given it on the way up. The clanking sound still audible somewhere above him on the grade, matching the same steady, deliberate rhythm it had established earlier that morning. He'd worked around old equipment his whole career. Wind doesn't keep a beat like that. Darrell reached the third switchback just as the co-worker's warning had suggested he would, the light overhead having shifted from the gray of an approaching storm into something closer to early dusk, despite it being nowhere near evening by the actual clock. He slowed the truck instinctively, some part of him treating the warning with more weight now that the specific conditions it described had actually materialized, the light changing exactly the way he'd been told it would. It was checking his rearview mirror, more out of habit than any particular concern, that he first noticed something wrong with the road sign he'd passed a short while earlier at the second switchback. On the way up that morning, it had read clearly, "Road closed ahead," facing the correct direction for any vehicle approaching from below. In the mirror now, it appeared reversed, the text facing the wrong way entirely, as though someone had physically turned the sign around to face oncoming traffic from the opposite direction. He slowed further, studying the reflection for a long moment, trying to work out an explanation involving the angle of his mirror or some trick of the fading light. Nothing about the reflection changed no matter how he adjusted his angle. The sign, as far as he could tell without turning around to check it directly, had genuinely reversed itself sometime between his ascent and his current position, despite there being no reasonable mechanism by which a bolted road sign could accomplish that on its own. His truck radio remained completely dead, the county channel offering nothing but flat silence no matter how he adjusted the dial, and the reality of his situation settled over him with a weight that hadn't been present earlier that morning. The only route back to the gate ran through the same narrow, single-lane grade he'd already traveled. No alternate path available given the terrain, no shoulder wide enough anywhere along the route to allow for much more than the most careful, deliberate driving. The clanking sound, which had continued steadily from somewhere above him on the grade for most of the morning, stopped abruptly as he approached the switchback, cutting off entirely rather than fading gradually the way ordinary structural noise typically would. In its place, a single set of footsteps started up on the gravel somewhere behind the truck, close enough that Darrell heard them clearly even through the closed windows, matching his own pace exactly when he finally stepped out of the vehicle to check the culvert work order's final measurements before heading back down. He stood there a long moment, the footsteps having gone silent the instant he'd stopped moving himself, and found himself facing a decision that felt considerably weightier than it should have for a county maintenance worker simply trying to finish a routine assignment. He didn't turn around to look. Some instinct, sharper and more insistent than any reasoning he could have articulated in the moment, told him that turning to look directly at whatever was producing those footsteps would be its own kind of mistake. A line crossed that he wouldn't be able to uncross afterward. He got back in the truck instead, closing the door with more force than strictly necessary, and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel before starting the engine, trying to steady the particular unease that had settled into his chest since the sign's reflection had first caught his eye in the mirror. He didn't turn around to look. He got back in the truck instead. Darrell made the decision, sitting there with the engine idling, and the gray light continuing to darken faster than any actual sunset should account for, not to attempt turning the truck around on a grade that offered no real room for the maneuver, especially not with visibility worsening and whatever had been pacing behind him somewhere close enough to hear its footsteps through closed windows. He put the truck in reverse instead, easing back down the narrow single-lane road the same way he'd come up, watching the mirror far more than he watched the road ahead, a choice that felt safer in the moment, even though it meant navigating blind curves largely by memory and instinct. He passed the third switchback again in this reversed crawl, refusing to look directly at it as the truck eased past, keeping his focus locked on the mirror instead, on the narrow stretch of gravel receding behind him, on anything except the specific spot where the footsteps had stopped and started with such deliberate precision only minutes earlier. The clanking didn't resume. The whole grade had gone quiet in a way that felt, if anything, more unsettling than the noise had been. The kind of silence that suggests something is simply choosing not to make sound rather than genuinely absent. He reached the second switchback and passed the reversed sign without stopping to examine it more closely, some part of him deciding firmly that he didn't want additional information about how or why it had turned itself around. The rest of the descent passed without further incident. At least, nothing Daryl could point to directly, though he remembers the entire drive down feeling longer than the ascent had that morning, stretched out in a way that didn't match the actual distance involved. At the gate, waiting at the bottom of the grade in the last of the fading light, he found the padlock hanging open, swinging gently on its hasp, despite his clear memory of locking it securely behind him that morning before starting the drive up. He stood there a moment, keys still in hand, working through the possibility that he'd simply forgotten to lock it properly, a mistake he didn't think he'd made but also couldn't entirely rule out given everything else that had happened that day. It was climbing back into the truck, keys finally secured and the gate locked properly behind him this time, that he noticed the coal dust. A thin, even layer of it coated the inside door handle, the side he'd been using to enter and exit the truck all day, a residue that hadn't been there that morning when he'd started the drive. He wiped at it with his thumb, confirming it was genuinely coal dust and not some trick of the fading light playing with ordinary road grime, and sat with that discovery for a long moment before finally starting the engine for the drive back to the yard. The county sent a different crew out a few days later to finish the actual culvert repair, a scheduling decision that Daryl didn't question at the time and was privately relieved by, given how little interest he had in returning to that particular grade himself. He checked the completed work order afterward, mostly out of habit, cross-referencing the listed completion time against his own memory of how long that kind of repair should reasonably take. The logged time exceeded his estimate by almost exactly an hour, a discrepancy nobody at the yard seemed to find worth commenting on, filed away as an ordinary variance in how different crews estimated their own labor time. The county took a follow-up photograph of the old mine entrance a few weeks after that, part of a routine documentation effort for infrastructure the county still technically owned, even though nobody used it. Daryl saw the photo eventually, passed around the yard along with a handful of other routine site updates, and noticed, studying it more carefully than anyone else seemed to, that one board at the corner of the boarded-over entrance had been pried loose. A small gap opened at the edge that hadn't been present in any earlier documentation of the site. Nobody had logged who had done it, or when, or why, the photograph simply existing alongside the rest of the routine paperwork without any accompanying explanation. Daryl still works for the county, still takes on maintenance assignments across the district without much complaint. The same steady, reliable worker he's always been. He simply doesn't take work orders for that particular road anymore, a preference he's made clear enough times through quiet, consistent avoidance that nobody at the yard has ever pushed him to justify directly. He hasn't been back, and given the choice, he doesn't intend to be. The last account is the one people in that county still do not like to discuss, the one that closes out everything you've heard so far, and the one that, once you've heard it, you may find yourself thinking about longer than any of the others. Hey, listen, at 2 a.m, standing on a cabin porch he'd rented for nothing more than a quiet weekend alone, he heard a voice call out his childhood nickname from just past the tree line, a nickname only one person on Earth had ever used, and that person had been gone for over a year. There was no way for anyone else to know it, no way for the woods to know it, And yet it came again, patient and familiar, waiting for him to answer. He never has. He has not gone camping or stayed anywhere without cell signal since that weekend. And he still hasn't told anyone the actual word the voice used. It began with something far more ordinary than any of that. It began with grief and a need for quiet, and a cabin chosen specifically because nobody would be able to reach him there. He'd booked the place, he explains, in the weeks following a sudden loss in his family, wanting nothing more than a stretch of time completely alone, somewhere remote enough that no one could call or text or check in, somewhere he could simply sit with what he was feeling without having to perform being okay for anyone else's benefit. The cabin sat past a shallow creek crossing that ran loud and constant the entire first evening, the kind of steady white noise that made the isolation feel almost peaceful rather than unsettling. He arrived with a single duffel bag, unpacked what little he'd brought, and got the wood stove going with more patience than skill, sitting afterward on the porch with a cup of black coffee, listening to the creek running its ordinary, busy course just past the edge of the yard. The first evening passed quietly, grief settling into something more manageable, with the isolation and the silence around him. Nothing about the setting suggesting anything beyond exactly what he'd come there for. It was the second evening that the creek went quiet, all at once. The steady rushing sound he'd grown used to simply stopping sometime after dark, replaced by a silence so complete it took him a moment to identify what exactly had changed about the air around the cabin. He checked a weather app before losing signal entirely for the night, found no obvious explanation for why the water level might have dropped so suddenly, and settled on blaming some kind of upstream diversion or a natural dry spell. A mundane explanation that let him set the thought aside and return to the quiet he'd actually come there for. The silence returned the following evening at almost exactly the same hour, and this time it arrived paired with something else. The birds in the yard, which had been calling steadily since he'd arrived, falling silent within the same few seconds as the creek itself, as though both had received some shared signal he couldn't perceive. He sat with that coincidence a long while, turning it over, telling himself that creeks were unpredictable by nature, that birds went quiet for all sorts of ordinary reasons having nothing to do with each other. He couldn't quite explain away the timing, though. Creeks being unpredictable was one thing. Birds going silent at the exact same moment the water did, 2 nights running, was a different kind of coincidence entirely. The sort that refuses to sit comfortably in the part of your mind reserved for things that don't need further thought. The cabin's caretaker, an older local man who checked in on the property periodically, and had mentioned, almost in passing when handing over the keys, that he lived close enough to hear if anything ever went wrong, stopped by the following afternoon to see how he was settling in. He mentioned the creek, framing it lightly, expecting maybe an easy explanation about seasonal water levels, or some quirk of the property he simply hadn't been told about. The caretaker went very still when he heard it, the same particular stillness Daryl's coworker had shown weeks earlier on an entirely different stretch of Appalachian Road, the stillness of someone hearing a description that matched something they already knew and had hoped, quietly, never to hear about again. "Don't go past the creek once that happens," he said, his voice lower than it had been a moment earlier. "And don't answer, no matter who it sounds like." He didn't explain further, and the man renting the cabin didn't press him to, some part of him understanding, the way people often do in these situations, that pushing for more detail wouldn't actually produce more comfort. The caretaker left shortly after, and a soft rain began sometime that evening, steady enough that the creek, when he checked it near dusk, had risen just enough to make crossing genuinely risky even if he'd wanted to. The cabin's single phone line, when he tried it out of habit rather than necessity, produced no dial tone at all, dead in a way that felt more deliberate than a simple service interruption should have. The voice came that night, closer to the porch than it had been on either of the previous evenings, using his childhood nickname in a tone that carried an unmistakable resemblance to the parent he'd lost, warm and familiar in exactly the way memory holds on to a voice you miss more than you'd ever admit out loud. He stood at the porch railing, listening, and noticed, the longer it continued, that something about the rhythm of the words was subtly wrong, the pacing slightly off, like someone who had heard the phrase spoken once perfectly and was now reciting it back from memory rather than actually knowing it the way the original speaker had. He stepped closer to the edge of the porch light anyway, drawn forward despite the wrongness he'd just identified, close enough that another few steps would have carried him past the boundary entirely and into the dark where the voice seemed to be coming from. He was close enough, in that moment, to almost answer, the word already forming somewhere in his throat before some other, quieter part of him pulled him back, made him retreat those same few steps toward the door and lock it behind him for the first time since he'd arrived at the cabin 3 days earlier. He almost said the word back. He still doesn't know, even now, what exactly stopped him. He didn't sleep much that night, sitting instead in a chair near the locked door with a lamp on beside him, listening to the rain build steadily against the roof, the dead phone line offering no comfort at all when he checked it again out of habit rather than hope. It was sometime after midnight that he first heard the sound beneath the floor, a slow, steady rhythm that took him a long moment to properly identify, mostly because identifying it meant admitting something he didn't want to admit. It sounded like breathing. Slow, patient, coming from the crawl space directly beneath where he sat, close enough that he could feel, or thought he could feel, some faint vibration through the floorboards in time with it. He didn't move. He sat with his back straight and his eyes on the door, listening to that sound continue steadily beneath him, refusing to let himself imagine too specifically what might be producing it, refusing to check, refusing to do anything except wait it out the way he'd already decided he would before it had even started. The porch light, which had burned steadily every night since he arrived, marking a boundary the voice and whatever accompanied it had respected without exception for 3 straight nights, flickered sometime after 2 and did not come back on. He noticed it through the front window, the familiar wash of light that had always painted a clear line at the edge of the yard, now simply absent. The darkness beyond the porch pressing closer to the cabin than it had at any point before. It was in that new darkness that he saw the shape at the tree line for the first time with any real clarity. Close enough now, without the porch light's boundary to hold it back, that its proximity alone told him everything he needed to know about how much the situation had changed. He didn't examine it further than he had to. He kept his eyes fixed mostly on the door instead, on the small manageable act of staying exactly where he was. The voice, when it came again, dropped his childhood nickname entirely and used his actual name instead, spoken plainly, without the same warmth it had carried before, a shift that felt less like an escalation in volume and more like an escalation in intention. He did not answer. He did not run for his truck, parked uselessly on the far side of the yard beyond a stretch of dark ground he had no intention of crossing. He simply sat with his back against the locked door, listening to the breathing continue beneath the floor, listening to his own name repeat itself from somewhere near the tree line, until the birds finally began calling again in the pale gray light of early morning, the sound arriving like something he hadn't realized he'd been waiting for with his whole body. In full daylight, once he'd gathered enough resolve to check, he found the crawlspace access beneath the cabin undisturbed in the way that specifically bothered him more than any obvious sign of intrusion might have. No footprints marked the dust down there, Nothing that suggested anything had physically entered or moved through the space in any conventional sense. What he did find, pressed flat into a section of old insulation near the center of the crawlspace, was a shape roughly the length and width of a person, lying perfectly still, the material compressed in a way that suggested sustained, unmoving weight rather than any single momentary contact. He stood there a long while, looking at that pressed shape in the insulation, and found he had no real explanation to offer himself for it. Nothing that made the discovery feel any smaller or easier to carry than it had felt in the dark hours before dawn. By mid-morning, the creek was running loud and ordinary again, exactly the way it had sounded that first evening, and the birds had returned to their usual steady calling throughout the yard, as though the entire property had simply reset itself back to the version he'd first arrived to. The caretaker stopped by not long after, checking in the way he had before, and didn't seem surprised at all by what he was told, only asked one question, quietly, before anything else. "Did you answer?" When told no, something in the older man's posture eased, a relief rather than curiosity, the reaction of someone who had genuinely feared a different outcome, rather than simply wondering about the details. It was while helping load the truck for the drive home that the caretaker mentioned something else, almost as an afterthought, delivered in the same easy tone he might have used to comment on the weather. The cabin's very first long-term renter, decades earlier, had also lost a parent shortly before staying there. That renter, he added, without any particular emphasis, had never checked out. Nothing more was said about it. The caretaker didn't offer further explanation, and the man leaving that morning didn't ask for one, understanding by now exactly how far these conversations tended to go before they simply stopped. He has not gone camping or stayed anywhere without cell signal since that weekend. He keeps a porch light burning at his own home every single night now, a small, quiet habit nobody in his life has ever questioned closely enough for him to have to explain it. He has never told anyone the specific nickname the voice used, not even the people who might have recognized it themselves, some part of him unwilling to let that particular word exist anywhere except inside his own memory. Months later, his phone buzzed once, late, a little after 2 in the morning. A single text from an unknown number containing nothing but the nickname itself. 4 letters, nothing else attached to it. When he called the number back the following day, unable to stop himself despite everything he'd learned about not answering, the carrier had no record of it ever having existed at all. The anthology closes not on the shape at the tree line or the pressed insulation beneath the floor, but on that quiet, ordinary image instead. A grieving man staring at a text message that shouldn't exist, still not answering it, and still, on certain nights, wondering whether he should have.